When was the last time you felt a little lazy? Surely, that report for your boss can wait another day, or maybe that IKEA shelf will also hold together with 1 or 2 screws less. I truly hope you're still employed by your boss, or that the shelf is still upright. But do you know where sloppiness can actually kill people? Aviation. Today we're going to take a look at an astonishing case where complacency led to a terrible disaster. Welcome to airspace. In the late evening hours of May 11, 2010, the crew of an Afriqiyah Airbus A330 was preparing for departure. This night flight should take their Airbus A330 from Johannesburg, South Africa to Tripoli, the capital of Libya. After departure, the 3 pilots, 8 flight attendants and 93 passengers settled in for what was going to be a very uneventful flight. Let's fast forward a bit to the early morning of the following day, May 12, 2010. As the crew approached Tripoli, they obtained the latest airport information, which indicated nothing unusual. Winds were reported to be calm, and the visibility was only slightly impaired due to some morning mist. Overall, it looked like their upcoming approach to their home airport would be a walk in the park. While the A330 descended, the first officer briefed the captain about the upcoming approach. Since all pilots were familiar with their home airport, the briefing was short and covered only the very basics, like the intended runway for landing. On this day, the pilots would have to approach Runway 09 using a locator approach. Such an approach uses pretty dated technology. To find the runway, pilots will use a non-directional beacon. This type of radio aid is not very precise, and the technology behind it was invented in 1932. Pilots will use it to find the right direction to the runway. Additionally, distance information from another nearby radio aid is used to find one's position. Luckily, modern planes like the A330 can use other systems such as GPS and inertial navigation to provide a more accurate position. In essence, this means that pilots will use the accurate GPS and inertial guidance to fly such an approach, and will only monitor the underlying locator beacon to see that it agrees with the GPS position. After all, the GPS track and the track provided by the beacon should be exactly the same. The advantage of following the GPS signal is that it is much less prone to signal fluctuations than the signal from the beacon. And so, the crew approached the airport. In the cockpit, the first officer was pilot flying, while the captain took the role of pilot monitoring. But as they descended, they soon found that the weather was worse than the weather report had indicated. Low clouds and mist hindered their visibility. Nevertheless, the pilots expected to see the runway soon. But when the aircraft reached the minimum descent altitude, that is the altitude at which the runway or the approach lights must be in sight by the latest, they only saw grey mist. Puzzled, the first officer asked the captain whether they should go around, but the captain hesitated and the first officer continued their descent. Seconds later, the ground proximity warning system issued a loud and determined warning: "Too low, terrain." This finally prompted the captain to order the first officer to go around. Without delay, the first officer switched off the autopilot and advanced the thrust levers to full power. But for some reason, the aircraft only climbed a few dozen feet. Instead of climbing, it started accelerating like a rocket, and soon it started to descend again. The ground proximity warning system continued warning loudly about the fact that the aircraft was dangerously close to the ground, but to no avail. The aircraft descended ever more rapidly and finally impacted the ground 1,200 meters or 3/4 of a mile short of runway 09. It crashed into a sandy plain at high speed and with tremendous energy. A huge explosion followed, and when the dust and flames settled, an 800 meters long and 90 meters wide debris field stretched south of the runway. Immediately, it looked like there could be no survivors to this tragedy. But miraculously, rescue services found a 9-year-old Dutch boy in the wreckage who was severely injured but alive. He was flown to a hospital and eventually made a full recovery. Sadly, he was the only survivor of this tragedy. Investigators soon arrived on the horrible scene and sought to find answers. Why had this aircraft crashed without a warning? Planes had landed just minutes before the crash, and they all did not report anything out of the ordinary, neither did the crew of Afriqiyah 771. So what went wrong? When they analyzed the wreckage, they were able to tell that tremendous energies had been involved, so the aircraft must have impacted the ground at a rather shallow angle and at high speed. The engines had been delivering close to full power. But then, why didn't the aircraft climb? Let's go back to the descent of Afriqiyah 771. Remember how the weather report indicated that the weather would be alright and that the first officer only delivered a very short briefing? Here lies the very first reason for the crash. The crew thought they knew their home airport well and that a complete briefing was not necessary. This is something that many pilots do. After the 100th time you've flown into your home airport, you know all the highlights, and so does your colleague probably. You wouldn't want to annoy your colleague with a pointless briefing, wouldn't you? This exact thinking is somewhat dangerous, however. Sure, sometimes briefings can feel tedious, and delivering a full briefing at your home base can feel like preaching to the choir. But if you don't do it, you might miss some essential dangers that the upcoming approach carries. The crew of Afriqiyah 771 fell victim to exactly this type of thinking. The first officer only briefed the captain about the runway which they were going to use and which procedure they would fly, but he didn't analyze what the procedure entailed, or how it was going to be performed and which autopilot modes he was going to use. You see, for a standard approach using an instrument landing system beam, that might work. It's a very easy approach and it can be done without an extensive briefing in most places. It's definitely not the right way to do it, but it can be done. But for the approach the crew of Afriqiyah 771 was going to fly, a locator DME approach, a much more extensive briefing would have been required. To fly this approach, the crew needs to verify that the correct beacon is tuned and that the GPS overlay used for navigation is correct. Then, the pilots have two choices. Either they can fly the so-called final descent in a mode that is very convenient, the so-called final approach mode. In this guidance mode, the aircraft will follow a 3D path down to the runway. This path is stored in the flight management system, and the aircraft position is verified via GPS and inertial navigation. It is very accurate and a really nice tool. But the approach can also be done using more pilot inputs. This is used if the final approach mode is unavailable. Here, the aircraft will just track the horizontal part of the navigation, again using GPS, while the pilots will adjust the descent angle themselves. On the Airbus A330, this is done using the flight path angle vertical mode, in which, as the name says, the pilot can choose and adjust a descent angle, for example 3 degrees. If pilots choose this type of approach, they need to know exactly where to descend and at which angle so that they find their landing runway in the end. So, as you can probably see, this type of approach requires a quite extensive briefing. Which modes are going to be used? Where is our descent point? At what angle do we need to descend, and most importantly, at which point do we need to see the runway? Without making any of these considerations, the crew of Afriqiyah 771 started their approach. Initially, nothing was amiss, but first signs of trouble appeared when the aircraft was already at 1800 feet and approaching the point where the final descent should be initiated. The captain suddenly said, let's do a nav approach? He was most likely referring to the final approach mode, the one where the plane follows a predetermined path in 3D space. This terminology was non-standard and ambiguous, but the first officer seemed to understand as he replied with, yes, okay. About 15 seconds later, the captain called out, track flight path angle, another call out that made no sense at this point. What he probably referred to was the so-called bird, a symbol indicating the aircraft track and flight path angle on the primary flight display. It is sometimes used in this type of approach, but it is not always required. The first officer said, okay, I will do it, but later. For now, everything was well and the aircraft was ready to track the final approach angle. But then, for some reason, the first officer started the descent of the aircraft prematurely by selecting a flight path angle. This would not have been required, the plane would have descended at the right position on its own. But maybe the first officer misunderstood the captain's instruction, track flight path angle, as an invitation to use the flight path angle mode instead of the easier final approach mode. When he made the change, the first officer called it out, but the captain was busy on the radios and never acknowledged his first officer's announcement. The plane now descended towards the ground at a steady angle. Unbeknown to the crew, this path would not lead them to the runway, but to a point which was short of it. In this weird mode that was partially guided, partially not, the plane descended towards the ground. Finally, when the aircraft reached 100 feet above the minimum descent altitude, the captain said, continue, probably in anticipation to see the runway any second now. A few moments later, the minimum descent altitude was passed, and the aircraft's computers called out minimum. At this point, the crew should have immediately initiated a go-around, since they were unable to see the runway. Instead, the The first officer hesitantly asked the captain whether he should actually go around or just continue. The ground proximity warning system issued a "too low terrain" warning. Now he agitatedly called for go around 3 times, and the first officer reacted by switching off the autopilot and advancing the thrust levers to full power. This is one way to do it, but it would have been much easier for him if he had just left the autopilot engaged. By just advancing the thrust levers to full power, the go-around would have been initiated and the autopilot would have executed it masterfully. But now, the first officer found himself startled in a situation with rapidly increasing workload. The aircraft was now rather light since most fuel had been burned in the cruise phase of the flight, and the 2 powerful engines delivered full power. Quickly, the A330 accelerated and its speed rapidly approached the red speed range, also called the barber pole due to its appearance. This denotes the maximum allowable speed the aircraft may fly in this configuration. It is not very high, therefore the first officer quickly wanted to retract the flaps to get more speed margin and to not overspeed the flaps. The captain quickly complied. But in all this, a very essential step was overlooked by the captain and the first officer. The first officer had never raised the nose to climb back into the sky. Instead, the plane just climbed at a very shallow angle for a short while and accelerated like a rocket powered by the 2 powerful engines at full power. Finally, the first officer started to provide an input on the side stick, but to the amazement of the investigators, he did not raise the nose, but he pushed it further down. This action seems completely illogical at this point. The aircraft had excess speed and did not climb. The only correct thing to do would have been to raise the nose. Why didn't he do so? According to the investigators, the first officer most likely fell victim to a somatographic illusion. This kind of illusion is very insidious. It is the illusion of climbing when in fact you are accelerating, and vice versa. Flight simulators use this illusion to simulate the forces of flight. If pilots take off in a simulator, the simulator will pitch back so that the pilots are pressed into their seats by gravity. This feels like an acceleration and therefore the takeoff feels more realistic. In case of Afriqiyah 771, the A330 quickly accelerated when the first officer demanded full power. Now, the brains of the pilots didn't really know if the plane was accelerating or climbing, the perceived sensation is more or less the same. Without properly monitoring their flight instruments, they didn't realize they were flying almost level, but thought they were climbing. It seems like the captain also fell victim to this illusion because he too started to provide nose-down inputs. Only in the last seconds of the flight did the first officer realize what was happening. He pulled up with all his might, but the captain had taken control using the priority button on his side stick. The captain's nose-down inputs finally sealed the fate of everyone on board. The plane crashed at high speed, and the rest is history. It appears that the story is easily told. An ill-prepared crew starts an approach to a runway they think they know well. This overconfidence eventually brings them in a situation they didn't expect, to which they react poorly, partially due to a treacherous illusion. But investigators look deeper into the history of Afriqiyah Airways and the pilots. They were rather amazed when they found out that the 2 pilots had already performed a pretty sloppy go-around 2 weeks before the accident. This go-around too happened in Tripoli when approaching runway 09. When the pilots flew this go-around, the pitch of the aircraft was all over the place too, varying from -2 all the way up to 25 degrees. For reference, a normal go-around pitch attitude is 15 degrees. In that case, the pilots flew too fast as well, exceeding the speed limit of their flaps in the process. This occurrence would have necessitated a report by the captain for various reasons, but neither the captain nor the first officer had filed such a report. Also, Afriqiyah's Flight Safety Office did not discover the incident, since the aircraft's data recorder was not read out regularly as would have been procedure. Since the incident was not discovered or reported, no lessons could be learned from it. Had the occurrence been debriefed, the pilots could have learned something and maybe this accident would not have happened. Another question remains. Why did the first officer start the final descent prematurely? Officially, the final descent starts at the locator beacon called Tango Whiskey, which is located 3.9 nautical miles from the runway. Since such a basic beacon only shows the pilots the direction to it, not the distance from it, it can be hard to tell when an aircraft is exactly overhead said beacon. To solve this, another navigation aid is used, a so-called DME or distance measuring equipment. It is located here in the middle of the airport area. On the approach chart, the procedure denotes that the final descent needs to be initiated at a distance of 3.9 nautical miles from the runway, which is a distance of 5.2 nautical miles from the mid-airport DME. But for some reason, the first officer messed these numbers up and started the final descent not 5.2 nautical miles from the DME, but from the runway threshold. This brought the aircraft on a path parallel to the actual final descent path and led them straight towards sandy terrain. The captain did not notice anything amiss at all, either. Finally, the investigation board concluded that very poor crew resource management was the root cause of this accident. The pilots had failed to create a shared mental model of the approach in the approach briefing and just dived into the approach head first and without proper planning. They were never sure which kind of navigation mode they were going to use and did not understand the system particularities behind them. When the approach finally turned out badly, the crew would have needed to go around, but once again, poor crew resource management and poor adherence to standard procedures inhibited them. Instead of going around immediately when no visual reference could be acquired at the minimum descent altitude, the first officer first sought confirmation from the captain. Instead, he should have gone around immediately and without undue delay. The captain, too, did not intervene and instead hesitated, which was clearly the wrong thing to do in this situation. And lastly, when the crew finally decided to go around, they did not have a proper notion on how to fly such a maneuver. Yes, a go-around is a dynamic procedure that demands a lot of attention, and many illusions can influence a pilot. But all pilots should, in theory, be trained to cope with these external influences. Had they monitored their instruments properly, any illusions could have been dispelled at a glance. But the investigators also raised another interesting point. The flying performance of these pilots was poor in the first place, but it seemed to be further impaired by fatigue. The pilots had flown to Johannesburg the night before, had spent their short rest period of just 15 hours during daylight time, only to perform another night flight just after that. They then had to land their airliner during the time they were biologically least awake at around 6 in the morning. Surely, this does not excuse the mistakes the pilots made. Their planning was poor, their execution of the approach was poor, and, in the end, they fell victim to illusions they should have known and mitigated. But fatigue really is an insidious phenomenon that can eventually lead us humans to be sloppy and complacent. So, what do you think about this accident? Do you think fatigue was the main factor here, or could the pilot's fatigue have been mitigated if they had been more aware of the dangers and the threats to this approach? Or was this maybe just a case of poor training? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, if you want to help to grow this channel, make sure to check out my Patreon. I have many cool benefits, such as early access to my videos, or even aviation-themed giveaways for Christmas. Last year, first-class supporters received an actual part of an aircraft. If you too would like to get your Christmas gift this year, make sure to join before November 1st. That said, thank you so much for watching, and see you all in the next one.